Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Ozark history. Today, we'll delve into the events that shook an entire community in the mountains of Arkansas in the midst of the early years of the 1920s. My name is Daniel Brooks. I was sheriff of Harlan County for 11 years, and in all that time, I never lost sleep over a case. Not truly. Not the kind where you wake at 3 in the morning and lie still, listening to the dark, afraid to move. Not until this one. I'm telling you this now because I'm old, and because some things deserve to be said out loud before a man takes them to his grave. It was 1914 when Caleb Turner first appeared on the ridge. Nobody knew where he'd come from. That alone wasn't unusual in those mountains. Eastern Tennessee had always drawn quiet men who preferred the company of trees to people. But there was something about Turner that made even the oldest settlers uneasy in a way they couldn't quite name. I remember old Pete Cassidy telling me once, "That man don't walk through the woods, Sheriff. He moves through it, like the woods already knows him." I laughed at that back then. I shouldn't have. Turner's cabin sat high on Alderman's Ridge, a good 4 miles from the nearest homestead. He came down to town maybe once every 6 weeks, bought flour, salt, a little tobacco, spoke to no one beyond what was necessary, and walked back up into the tree line without looking back. Some folks said he never blinked right. Others said his shadow fell the wrong direction in the afternoon light. People in mountain communities talk. I always knew to separate the superstition from the fact. What I didn't know yet, what none of us knew, was that separating the two in this case was going to take everything we had. His eyes, when you did catch them, were pale, almost colorless. Not threatening exactly. Just empty in a way that made you want to look somewhere else, quickly. The way you look away from a thing you don't want to give attention to. I wish I had given it more attention sooner. The ridge itself had a reputation long before Turner arrived. Local Cherokee families had avoided that particular high ground for generations, called it something in their language that the old traders roughly translated as the place where sound goes in. I didn't know what that meant when I first heard it. By the time I understood it, 3 people were already gone. But that comes later. In those first months, Turner was nothing more than an oddity, a strange neighbor in a land of strange neighbors. The mountains kept their secrets, and so did he, and for a while, the two seemed suited to each other just fine. The first winter he was there, nothing happened. The second winter, the lights appeared. It started small, the way most terrible things do. In the early months of 1915, families living closest to Alderman's Ridge began talking. At first, I dismissed it as the usual winter restlessness. Long, dark nights breed long, dark imaginations, and mountain people have always had a gift for turning a distant lantern into something supernatural. But the reports kept coming, and what unsettled me wasn't the strangeness of them. It was how consistent they were. Separate families, miles apart, describing the same thing. Faint blue lights, moving slowly through the tree line above the ridge. Not flickering like torches, not swinging like lanterns carried by a walking man. Just drifting, patient, almost purposeful, disappearing behind the tree trunks and reappearing further along, like something that knew exactly where it was going and wasn't in any hurry to get there. Thomas Harper, Lucy's father, though I didn't know Lucy yet, didn't know what her name would come to mean to me. Thomas told me he'd watched those lights for nearly an hour one February night from his porch. He said he'd gone inside finally, not because he got cold, but because he realized he'd been standing there without breathing properly. I wrote it down. I didn't act on it. That was my first mistake in this case. It wouldn't be my last. The symbols came next, found carved into the flat faces of the limestone outcroppings along the lower trail, the path that connected 3 homesteads to the old mill road. Nobody claimed to have carved them. Nobody recognized them as letters from any alphabet they knew. They weren't crude scratches either. They were deliberate, measured, cut with something sharp, and guided by something patient. I rode out and looked at them myself in late March. I remember crouching down, running my thumb along one of the deeper cuts, and feeling, I don't know how else to say this, feeling like the stone was warmer than it should have been. Like whatever had made that mark had done it recently. I told myself it was the afternoon sun on the rock face. Even then, somewhere underneath that reasonable explanation, something in me knew better. The sounds were the last sign, and the worst one. Not because they were loud, they weren't. They were the opposite of loud. A low humming that seemed to come from no particular direction, drifting down from the ridge after midnight, threading itself through the valley like smoke. Several families reported waking to it. Children would sit up in their beds and ask their mothers what the singing was. Their mothers didn't have answers. One detail stayed with me long after everything else in this case had been written up and filed away. Margaret Cole, Ethan's mother, though again, I didn't know Ethan yet. Margaret told me the humming had a pattern to it. Not a melody exactly, more like breathing, like something enormous just beyond the tree line, slowly breathing in and out. She said it stopped the same moment every night, 3 o'clock exactly. She knew because she'd started watching the clock, the way you watch a clock when you're afraid and you need something solid to hold on to. I think about that detail more than I should, because later, much later, after everything had come apart, I would find something in that tunnel under the ridge that suggested the timing wasn't accidental, that 3 o'clock meant something specific to Caleb Turner. But I'm getting ahead of myself. By summer of 1915, the unease along the ridge had settled into the community the way cold settles into old bones, quietly, completely, in a way that's hard to point at directly, but impossible to ignore. People locked their doors earlier. Fathers walked their children to the creek rather than letting them go alone. Conversations at the general store grew shorter, quieter, as if everyone had privately agreed not to say certain things out loud. Nobody had disappeared yet. That was still coming, and when it came fast. The first to disappear was Lucy Harper, 16 years old, Thomas Harper's youngest daughter. She went to fetch water from the creek on a Tuesday morning in September, a walk she had made every single day of her life, and she didn't come back. Thomas waited 2 hours before he came to me. I could see in his face that he'd spent those 2 hours convincing himself there was a reasonable explanation, that she'd twisted an ankle on the path, that she'd stopped to talk to someone, that the world was still the kind of place where 16-year-old girls went to fetch water and came home again. He stood in my doorway with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, and he said, "Sheriff, I think something's wrong." I rode out within the hour. We found her bucket at the edge of the creek, lying on its side, the handle still looped over a root where she would have set it while she waited for it to fill. The ground around it was undisturbed. No signs of struggle. No tracks leading away that we could follow for more than 20 feet before the dry rock swallowed them. She was simply gone. I want you to understand what that means in those mountains. This wasn't a city, wasn't a place with crowds and strangers passing through. This was a valley where everyone knew everyone, where a stranger's horse would be noticed and remembered and talked about for a week. For a person to vanish from a creek crossing she'd walked 1,000 times, in broad morning light, without a sound, without a single witness, was not just frightening, it was wrong. Fundamentally, deeply wrong, in a way I felt in my chest before I could articulate it in my mind. I told Thomas we'd find her. I believed it when I said it. Ethan Cole disappeared 3 weeks later. He was 19, a hunter, knew those woods better than most men twice his age. He'd gone up the eastern slope after deer and hadn't returned by nightfall. His family waited until morning. Hunters sometimes camped out, it wasn't unusual. But when dawn came and Ethan didn't, his older brother rode to find me. We searched for 4 days. Found one of his boot prints on a soft patch of earth about a mile below the ridgeline. Found a place where brush had been pushed aside, like something had been dragged or pulled through it. Found nothing else. No Ethan. No explanation. I didn't sleep well after that. Not because I was afraid, or not only because of that, but because I had the persistent, maddening feeling that I was looking at something I should be able to read, like words in a language I almost knew. The creek, the slope, the ridge above both of them. I should have drawn the map sooner. That thought has never fully left me. Mary Lawson was the third. A schoolteacher, 32 years old, lived alone in a small house at the edge of the valley. Quiet woman, capable, well-liked. She disappeared on a Wednesday night in November, sometime between when her neighbor saw lamplight in her window at 10 o'clock and when that same neighbor found her front door standing open at sunrise. Her bed had been slept in. Her coat was still on its hook. Her shoes were beside the door. Whatever had taken Mary Lawson had taken her in the night, without her coat, without her shoes, without a sound that anyone had heard. I stood in her kitchen that morning and looked at those shoes for a long time. By now, the fear in the community wasn't quiet anymore. It had moved past whispers into something harder and louder. Accusations, arguments, a kind of angry desperation that comes when people are frightened and have nowhere useful to put it. Some blamed a drifter nobody could describe. Some blamed each other. Some, in lowered voices, spoke the name they'd been circling around for months. Caleb Turner. I hadn't forgotten him. I want to be clear about that. But I had no evidence. A strange man living alone on a ridge is not a crime, and I had built my career on the difference between suspicion and proof. What I didn't have yet was the map. When Samuel Carter arrived from Knoxville, and we finally spread the papers out on my desk and drew the 3 locations, the creek, the eastern slope, Mary Lawson's house, and then marked Turner's cabin at the center, the room went very quiet. The 3 points formed a near-perfect circle, and Turner's cabin sat exactly in the middle of it. Samuel Carter was not a man who frightened easily. He'd been sent from Knoxville at my request, a state investigator with 15 years of experience, the kind of man who approached every case like a problem in mathematics. Logical, methodical, unimpressed by atmosphere or rumor. When he stepped off the wagon and shook my hand, he looked up at Alderman's Ridge with the flat, professional gaze of a man who had seen worse. By the end of his first week here, that look was gone. I noticed it change on the 3rd day, when we walked the perimeter of what we'd started calling the circle. He didn't say anything. Carter wasn't a man who announced his unease, but I watched him pause at certain points along the tree line. Pause and stand very still, the way an animal stands still when it senses something it hasn't identified yet. And I knew that the mathematics of this case were starting to feel like something else to him. Something that didn't have a clean equation. We entered the woods above the ridge on a Thursday morning in early December. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the ground was hard, which was both a help and a hindrance. Easier walking, but harder tracking. Carter carried a rifle. I carried mine. Neither of us said out loud why we'd both decided to bring them. The first thing we found was the path. Not a deer trail. Those have a particular randomness to them, a looseness that follows the animal's instinct rather than any plan. This was deliberate. narrow, kept clear of fallen branches, winding between the trees in a route that someone had thought about carefully. Someone who didn't want it seen from below. Someone who knew these woods well enough to route the path along the natural shadows of the terrain. I had walked these woods for years and never noticed it. That bothered me more than I let on to Carter. We followed it for nearly a mile before we found the first stone circle. Small, maybe 8 feet across, stones roughly the size of a man's head, placed with a precision that felt out of place this deep in the wilderness. The ground inside the circle was dark, stained in a way that old fire residue sometimes stains soil. But there was no ash, no charcoal, no wood remnants of any kind. Carter crouched over the darkened earth for a long time without speaking. When he stood, he said only, "There's more than one of these." He was right. We found 2 others within a quarter mile, arranged in a configuration that, when I sketched it in my notebook and looked at it later that night, corresponded almost exactly to the triangle formed by the 3 disappearance sites in the valley below. I didn't sleep at all that night. The traces of blood were found the following day, near a clearing about 200 yards north of Turner's cabin. Not a large amount, not the scene of an obvious violence, more like something had been brought there, and something had happened there, and someone had made a careful effort afterward. The kind of careful effort that comes from practice. That detail, the practiced carefulness of it, settled into me like a stone dropping into deep water. Because it meant this wasn't impulse, wasn't madness in the sudden, explosive sense. Whatever Caleb Turner had been doing in these woods, he had been doing it deliberately, repeatedly, and he had been doing it for long enough to get good at covering it. How long, I didn't know yet. I was afraid to find out. We were preparing to widen the search the next morning when Carter grabbed my arm and pulled me still. He'd heard something in the brush to our left, a small sound, a shifting of dry leaves, the kind a deer makes when it decides to hold its ground rather than run. But it wasn't a deer. It was a boy. He was crouched in the hollow space between the roots of an old oak, knees pulled to his chest, watching us with eyes that had the particular blankness of a child who has learned that stillness is survival. Thin, dirty, dressed in clothes that had once belonged to someone larger. He looked at us for a long moment before he decided something, and then he climbed slowly out of the hollow and stood up straight. He told us his name was Oliver. He looked about 10 years old, though it was hard to say. Hard living ages children in ways that make guessing unreliable. He spoke quietly and carefully, in the measured way of someone who has learned to say only what is necessary. And what he said, standing there in the cold December woods, with his hands loose at his sides, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in a way that no crime scene ever had. He said Turner had told him the hills were alive with ancient spirits, that the circles were doors, that the things taken into the forest were offerings, not to God, not to any God Oliver had a name for, but to something older than names. He said Turner had made him help carry things into the woods at night. He said he had never looked at what was inside the bundles. I believed him. I believed him completely, and I have spent years being grateful that he'd had the sense not to look. Because what we found in the tunnel the next morning told us enough about what those bundles contained. I have described a lot of things in my years as sheriff, written them into reports, spoken them before judges, repeated them to investigators who needed the facts laid out plainly. I have learned to say difficult things in a steady voice. What we found in that tunnel is the one thing I still cannot say steadily. Oliver led us to it the morning after we found him. He walked ahead of us through the frost-hardened woods with a quiet purposefulness that troubled me, the purposefulness of a child who has accepted terrible things as ordinary. He didn't hesitate on the path, didn't slow down as we approached. He simply walked to a particular stretch of hillside north of the stone circles, crouched down, and pulled aside a covering of dead branches and packed earth that had been arranged to look like nothing at all. Beneath it was a door, wooden, heavy, set flush into the hillside at a slight downward angle, hinged with iron, latched from the outside. Carter and I looked at each other over the boy's head. I told Oliver to step back and stay back. He obeyed without argument, and something about that immediate, wordless compliance hurt me in a way I hadn't expected. It told me more about what his life near that cabin had been than anything he'd said the previous day. We lifted the door. The smell came first, cold earth and something underneath it, something older and darker that I recognized from crime scenes and couldn't pretend was anything else. Carter pulled out his lantern. We went down 6 rough steps, cut directly into the earth, and stood in a low space, maybe 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, with timber supports along the walls, and a dirt floor that had been worn smooth by repeated use. The belongings were arranged along the walls. That's the word I keep returning to, arranged. Not thrown, not piled, not hidden in haste. Arranged, with the deliberate neatness of someone who assigned meaning to objects. A woman's shawl, folded carefully over a timber support. A hunting knife in a leather sheath, hung on a wooden peg. A pair of child's shoes, small, worn at the toes, placed side by side on a flat stone, as if their owner had simply stepped out of them and would be back shortly. I recognized the shawl. I had seen it described in Mary Lawson's missing persons report. Her neighbor had mentioned it specifically. A blue wool shawl, hand-embroidered at the edges, a gift from her mother. I stood there looking at it for longer than I should have. Carter had to say my name twice before I heard him. There were other things. A school primer with a name written inside the front cover in a child's careful handwriting. A name I didn't recognize, which meant the tunnel held evidence of disappearances we hadn't even known to investigate yet. A man's pocket watch, stopped at 3 o'clock. Lengths of rope, coiled and hung like tools in a workshop. A journal, water-damaged, the ink in most of it too blurred to read. Carter bagged the journal carefully. Later, a document examiner in Knoxville would manage to recover fragments of it, enough to confirm that Turner had been recording his activities in these woods in a cipher that mixed English letters with the same symbols we'd found carved into the limestone outcroppings. Enough to suggest the disappearances we knew about were not the first, not even close to the first. The earliest legible date in that journal was 1909. Turner had been on that ridge for 6 years before anyone had thought to be afraid of him. I have never fully forgiven myself for those 6 years. Oliver, we learned over the following days, had been living near the cabin for almost 8 months. He was 11 years old, I'd guessed close, and had originally come from a family 2 counties over. He'd been separated from them under circumstances he described in fragments over several conversations, never quite in order. What emerged was a picture of a child who had been slowly drawn into Turner's orbit, the way all of Turner's victims seemed to have been, gradually, carefully, with patience that, in retrospect, was the most frightening thing about the man. Turner had never threatened Oliver directly, had never needed to. He had simply made himself the boy's only source of food, warmth, and company, in a wilderness where the alternative was starvation. That was its own kind of trap, and it had worked completely. Oliver told us one other thing before we left the woods that day. He said that in the last weeks before we arrived, Turner had changed,
had become agitated in a way that was new, pacing the cabin at night, muttering, spending long hours at the stone circles alone. He said Turner had told him once, in a moment that Oliver described as almost gentle, that the spirits of the hills were becoming impatient, that they had been promised something he hadn't yet delivered. Oliver didn't know what that something was.
Standing at the entrance to that tunnel, looking back down into the lantern-lit dark, I thought I understood. And the thought made me close the door faster than was strictly necessary. We went to arrest Caleb Turner on a Friday morning. Carter had ridden to Knoxville and back with the warrant. I had deputized 2 men I trusted, solid, quiet men who didn't frighten easily and didn't talk unnecessarily. We rode up to Alderman's Ridge in the gray pre-dawn light, 4 of us, moving along that hidden path we now knew by heart. And when we reached the cabin clearing and I raised my fist to knock on that door, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. The anticipation of an ending. I should have known by then that this case didn't end cleanly. The cabin was empty, not abandoned. The fire in the stove was still warm. A tin cup sat on the table with coffee dregs dried in the bottom. A coat hung on its peg by the door. Turner had been there recently. Recently enough that the warmth of him still seemed to be in the room, and that thought, the warmth of him still in the room, made me want to step back outside into the cold air. We searched for 3 days. The mountains are vast, and they are old, and they do not give up what they decide to keep. I knew that better than most. We covered every trail we'd found, every stone circle, every shadow of a path through the timber. Carter organized search parties from the valley, volunteers, grim-faced men who had lost neighbors and wanted this finished. We found nothing. On the 4th day, a boy fishing in Darrow Canyon found Caleb Turner, or what remained of him. He was at the bottom of a rocky slope, in a narrow defile where the canyon walls came close enough together to block most of the light, even at midday. The county physician who examined him said he had been dead approximately 3 days. The cause, after careful examination, was poisoning. A plant compound, the physician believed. Something found in those mountains if you knew where to look and how to prepare it. There was no note, no confession, no final explanation. What there was, placed on a flat rock beside the body with the same deliberate neatness we'd found in the tunnel, was a single carved stone. The same symbols we'd seen on the limestone outcroppings, the same symbols from his journal. Carter picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and set it back down without a word. We never determined with certainty whether Turner had taken his own life or whether someone had helped him to that ending. The evidence suggested the former. The circumstances, the remoteness of the location, the careful placement of that stone, suggested a man who had chosen his own terms. But there were details that didn't sit flush, the way a warped board never quite lies flat, no matter how many nails you put through it. Someone had known exactly where to find him. The case was closed officially in the spring of 1916. 3 confirmed victims: Lucy Harper, Ethan Cole, Mary Lawson, though the journal fragments suggested the real number was higher. Oliver was returned to his family, quieter than an 11-year-old boy should be, carrying things behind his eyes that I hope the years were kind enough to gradually soften. Carter went back to Knoxville, and I never worked with him again, though he wrote to me once, years later, a short letter that said only that he still thought about the tunnel. I wrote back and told him I did too. I'm telling you this now, all of it, from the beginning, because I believe some things need witnesses. Not just official records in courthouse files, but human voices saying plainly,
This happened. These people were real. Lucy Harper fetched water every morning of her life. Ethan Cole knew those woods like a second home.
Mary Lawson taught children to read in a one-room schoolhouse and kept a blue shawl her mother had made her. They deserve to be remembered by name. And if this account has moved you, if these voices from the mountains have stayed with you the way they have stayed with me across all these years, then I ask something simple of you. Stay with this story. There are other cases, other valleys, other names that deserve the same witness. Subscribe so that when the next account is ready, it finds you. Leave a word in the comments if this reached you, not for my sake, but because these stories grow stronger when more people carry them. The official record says the case of Caleb Turner is closed. But last summer, and I tell you this as plainly as I have told you everything else, a farmer's son, walking the old ridge trail, found a stone circle in the woods above Alderman's Creek, recently made. The stones placed with careful precision. The ground inside darkened in a way that had nothing to do with old fire. Nobody claimed to have built it. Nobody, as far as I know, has looked very hard for who did. I am an old man. I have earned the right to leave certain things to younger hands. But I will tell you what I told Carter in that letter all those years ago, when he said he still thought about the tunnel. I told him, so do I. And I think about what was promised to the hills. And I think about whether the hills are still waiting. He never wrote back after that. I've always thought that meant he understood exactly what I meant.